Hey guys, Arush here, and today we're talking about the theory of evolution. Before we start talking about evolution, let's go over two key vocabulary words. Number one, we have evolution. And what evolution is, it's the gradual change in a population over time. So, remember I talked about at the beginning of the school year that everything that occurs in biology occurs at a specific level of organization. Atoms, molecules, organelles, cells, tissues, so on and so forth. Well, where does evolution occur, or how does that fit into this whole thing? Evolution occurs at the population level. And if you remember when we talked about ecology, populations was the first level that we talked about in ecology, okay? Or all members of one species. So that whole group of all members of one species, that whole group together gradually changes over time. It's not necessarily one individual. The next key word would be natural selection. And what natural selection is it's describing when traits that help an organism to survive and reproduce. Okay? So everything in biology revolves around these two concepts. Survival and reproduction. If you don't survive, then that means you die. And if you don't reproduce, then that means eventually your species will die. So natural selection is talking about traits that help the organism survive and reproduce. At the beginning of the semester, we talked about these five individuals. We have Gregor Mendel, we have Rosalind Franklin, Watson, and Crick right here. Okay. Gregor Mendel, he was the father of genetics. Rosalind Franklin and Watson and Crick, they helped to discover the structure and shape of DNA. And next we're going to talk about this guy, Charles Darwin. Okay. Now, if Gregor Mendel is the father of genetics, Charles Darwin is without a doubt the father of evolution. So here's a little story about Charles Darwin. Well, he was a naturalist, and what he liked to do is he liked to observe nature and take note and catalog things. So he lived around early to mid 1800s, and he was part of a voyage on a ship called the Beagle, and they traveled to a group of islands called the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands was this cluster, okay, all these small islands in close proximity to each other. And one of the first things that he noticed was all the animals, all the species on each island were extremely similar, but they had variations depending upon which island they lived on. Okay, so if he went to one island, he might see tortoises with one characteristic, but the tortoises on a separate island would have slightly different characteristics. Another species that he looked at were finches. So if I show you this picture of a finch, take a look at his beak. He has a rather large, strong, thick beak, and he has relatively larger muscles in his jaw area. Okay, so larger beak, thicker, and larger jaw muscles. Another type of finch, if you notice, very, very smaller beak, close to its face, doesn't have a lot of musculature in its face, and it's real short. Another variation might be a narrow type beak, longer and more fine. Okay, so what he noticed is these variations fit their diet. So let's take a look at these. This is three possible choices. We have small soft seeds, large seeds, and cactus fruit. Okay, based on the size and shape of the finches, what do you think their diet would consist of? And right now, go ahead and put it on pause and think to yourself, what would the diet of the large beak finch consist of? Would it be small seeds, cactus fruit, or large seeds? So the large beak finch mostly ate larger seeds. Okay, so it needed that strong musculature and that thick beak to crack open those larger seeds. If you look at the cactus fruit, this would be the area that was nutrition for the finches. And they would have to have a finer beak to access the flesh inside of that cactus fruit. Now, which finch would have a beak suitable for that type of diet? That would be the fine beak finch. And finally, the short beak finch ate smaller and softer seeds. So he noticed that their diet was dependent on the size and shape of their beak. Now let's take a look at this scenario, for example. Let's say there's a drought. Let's say there's a drought on this island, and which source of food would be most likely to survive? It would be the cactus, because cacti are more likely to survive shortages of water. So let's say there's a drought. This food source dwindles down, and this food source dwindles down. Which trait would you want to have if you were a finch? Well, you'd want to have the longer, narrow beak. So if that were to happen, you would see an increase in the fine beak finch, okay? And you would see a decrease in the short beak and the large beak finch, okay? There was more variations. Some of them had a beak that was useful for using tools to kind of probe and get insects out of small holes. Some of them ate buds on flowers, okay? And here's another scenario. On one island, Darwin noticed that one variation was neck length. He noticed that one island had tortoises with extremely long necks, huge necks. And on another island, all he saw was short-necked tortoises, okay? Now, why would this happen? Well, if you look at both pictures, look at this picture, for example. Where's the majority of the food at? The majority of the food is on the ground level. So this tortoise wouldn't need to reach up higher. On the other island, however, there's not a lot of vegetation on the ground, okay? This is all dirt. So there was a pressure, if you were a tortoise, to have a longer neck. You had to adapt to have a longer neck so you could reach the higher levels. And what his thought was, since each island had a different characteristic of tortoises, okay, that all of these tortoises had a common ancestor. That, you know, the species of tortoises lived on one island, and then over time, somehow these tortoises were migrated to other areas, and based on those conditions, they adapted or evolved to have those beneficial characteristics. So what he thought was, or this right here would be a picture he drew in his notebook. This is actually a pretty famous picture, and what this is suggesting is that all life has one common ancestor, and life started to branch off. And this is where we got the different, or the diversity of life that we know today is from this one common ancestor, just like these tortoises. And then gradually there was changes within those populations. So in short, Darwin thought that each tortoise had the same common ancestor. Okay, and now let's talk about the different steps or the different points of natural selection. The first point of natural selection is called overproduction. Or overproduction is every species produces more individuals than can survive to maturity or can survive to reproductive age. In short, there's too many offspring. Okay, so what we're going to use this example of beetles to show natural selection. So right now we're at the first stage, and this is overproduction. There's more beetles than there are resources. The second point to natural selection is variation. And what variation shows is within this population of beetles, okay, within this population, there's differences. So we have a large green beetle. We have a small green beetle. We have large teal, small teal. You'll even notice that there's different designs on each shell. They can be different shapes, different sizes, okay? So they're all different. Just like you and your siblings, if you have any siblings, you guys are all different. You have different characteristics. This would show variation. Now, why is variation in a species a good thing? If you remember before I mentioned this, if everyone is the same, then we all have the same strengths and the same weaknesses. So we want variation, okay? We want to have that genetic diversity. So variation is good. It ensures that there's a higher likelihood that some individuals of a population will survive to reproduce. The third point of natural selection is competition. Okay? Competition. The first was overproduction, too many offspring. Second was variation. They're all different. The third one is competition. There's going to be some sort of hardship, or there's going to be a struggle to survive. Okay, and the key word in here is struggle. So let's say these beetles live on an area where there's a lot of greenage, a lot of vegetation. Well, which color is going to stand out to predators? Well, the teal are. So the teal or the individuals that have the teal color, they're going to dwindle down. Okay, the green are more likely to survive, to reproduce. Okay, we may have some individuals that are teal that remain, but the most favorable trait is to be green. The last step of natural selection is called selection, and in this one, the traits that help the individual survive and reproduce, you're going to find those traits more common in the population now. Okay, so in this scenario, being green was beneficial. So over time, we're going to see an increase in that trait. Okay, we may still see some of the teal individuals, but we're not going to see them as frequent. Okay, we're going to see the green beetles more frequent because that's what's beneficial, and that is natural selection. Okay. One last example. Let's take this little scenario. Let's say we have two long neck tortoises, and let's say they have offspring. Okay, and we're going to use the steps of natural selection for this. So, them having 4 offspring would be overproduction. There's more offspring than the environment can maintain. So first, overproduction. The second step would be variation. If you notice, these tortoises have different shells, have different colors, different shapes, and even different neck lengths. Okay? So that would be step 2, variation. Step 3 would be competition. Now, in this scenario, the trait that is not favorable would be having a short neck. Because let's say there's not so much vegetation on the ground, this guy is going to run out of food, this tortoise right here, it's going to run out of food, and it's going to have to try to reach to the upper levels. It's not going to be able to do so, so having a short neck is going to be selected against. He's going to dwindle from the population. Okay. Over time, which individuals are going to be allowed to reproduce? Well, these 3 with their long necks. Okay, they're going to be the ones. Actually, should change that. These 3 are going to be the ones to survive and reproduce. So we're going to see more of the long neck variation in the population. That was natural selection. Hope that was helpful. Make sure to like and subscribe.